The wind bit hard through Elias Thorne's threadbare flannel, carrying the scent of pine and the distant mournful cry of a coyote. His axe, a familiar weight in his calloused hands, had carved a solitary existence for him deep in the Oregon timberlands. For 15 years, since the day his young daughter Lily had vanished from their small homestead, Elias had lived with a hollow ache in his chest, a constant echo of loss that the rhythmic thud of his axe couldn't quite drown out. His cabin, a crude structure of logs and mud, was more a testament to survival than comfort, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. The only companions he knew were the towering Douglas firs and the occasional trapper passing through, their brief visits doing little to alleviate his profound loneliness. He was a man shaped by the wilderness, hardened by sorrow, and resigned to a future as desolate as the clear-cut patches he left in his wake. The isolation, once a form of penance, had become his only true constant, a heavy cloak he wore against the persistent chill of his memories. One late autumn afternoon, a ragged wagon creaked its way down the winding trail leading to the small dusty settlement of Willow Creek. Elias, having ventured into town for supplies, watched with a weary curiosity as a man, thin and shifty-eyed, hawked a young girl to a small crowd. Her dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt, but it was her eyes, a striking shade of green that seemed too vibrant for her pale, drawn face, that caught Elias's attention. They held a glimmer of defiance, a spark that resonated with a long-buried memory. He heard snippets of conversation. Orphan, kin, needs a home. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He'd seen this before, desperate families selling their children into servitude. The desperation in the girl's eyes, even through her mask of stoicism, was palpable, stirring something dormant within his calloused heart. Without much thought, driven by an impulse he couldn't name, Elias stepped forward. "How much for the girl?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. The shifty-eyed man, surprised by the lumberjack's sudden interest, quickly named a price. Elias, after a moment's hesitation that stretched into an eternity of internal debate, pulled a small leather pouch from his belt and counted out the coins. The transaction was swift, cold, and transactional, a stark exchange of money for a life. The girl, no older than 10 or 11, stared at him with a mixture of fear and wary curiosity. He offered her a calloused hand. "Come on, child," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended, a sound almost alien to his own ears. "You're coming with me." The townspeople watched, some with pity, some with judgment, as the grizzled lumberjack led the small, silent girl away. The journey back to his cabin was silent, save for the creak of the wagon wheels and the rustling leaves. Elias tried to make conversation, asking her name, where she came from, but she only offered curt, almost inaudible replies. "Mary, don't remember much." He didn't press. He understood silence. As they neared the cabin, a sense of unease settled over him. What had he done? He, a solitary lumberjack, with no experience in raising a child, much less a girl. He was a man of the woods, of solitude, not of family. The cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to shrink around him, a stark reminder of his solitary existence, soon to be disrupted by a child he barely knew. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky, in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows that mirrored the uncertainties swirling in Elias's mind. He realized, with a jolt, that he had just opened the door to a part of his life he had long believed was buried with his daughter. Life with Mary was, at first, a clumsy dance of unfamiliar steps. Elias found himself constantly aware of her small presence in his usually empty cabin. He cooked simple meals of venison and dried beans, watching as she ate cautiously, her eyes darting around the small space as if ready to flee at any moment. He taught her how to chop kindling, how to draw water from the well, and how to identify edible berries in the surrounding forest. Mary, despite her initial reticence, was a quick study. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her small hands surprisingly strong, and her keen observations often surprised him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid silence between them began to soften, punctuated by the crackle of the fireplace and the distant calls of birds. He noticed the careful way she mended her torn dress, the way she hummed a tuneless melody, while sweeping the dirt floor, little signs of a spirit that, despite hardship, still sought a semblance of order and beauty. Days bled into weeks, and the initial awkwardness began to yield to a fragile routine. Elias found himself looking forward to the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere when she was there. He'd even started leaving out small pieces of fruit, apples or wild berries he'd gathered, and felt a strange warmth when he saw them gone. One evening, during a particularly fierce rainstorm that hammered against the cabin walls, Mary sat by the fire, meticulously carving a small wooden bird with a piece of salvaged kindling and Elias's old hunting knife. The focused intensity on her face, the delicate movements of her fingers, stirred a flicker of a long-lost memory within him. He remembered Lily, so young, carving a crude wooden doll with a stick, her tongue poking out in concentration. A painful pang shot through his chest, a ghost of a smile appearing on his lips before fading. As the months turned colder, forcing them to spend more time indoors, Mary slowly started to open up. She spoke in hushed tones about scattered memories. A woman with a kind laugh, a lullaby she vaguely remembered, the smell of fresh-baked bread. She never spoke of the man who sold her, nor of the circumstances that led her to him, and Elias didn't push. He respected her unspoken boundaries, understanding that some wounds were too raw to touch. He saw how the harsh life she'd endured had left its marks, a quiet resilience in her posture, a wisdom in her gaze that belied her young age. He saw not just a child, but a survivor, someone who had learned to navigate a world that had offered her little kindness. One evening, while Elias was mending a torn tarp, Mary stumbled upon an old, dusty wooden box tucked beneath his bunk. Curiosity piqued, she carefully pulled it out. Inside, nestled amongst faded photographs and a dried bouquet of wildflowers, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Her breath hitched. It was almost identical to the one she was carving, with the same distinctive notch on the wing. As she picked it up, a faint, barely legible inscription on the bottom caught her eye. "For Lily, my brave girl." Her hands trembled. Elias looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the box, and then the bird in her hand. The air in the cabin grew, thick with unspoken questions, with the heavy weight of a past about to collide with the present. The rhythmic sound of the rain outside seemed to amplify the sudden, profound silence between them. Mary's gaze, fixed on the wooden bird, slowly shifted to Elias, a new, unnerving intensity in her green eyes. This looks like something I used to have," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Elias felt a cold wave wash over him. He walked slowly, deliberately towards her, his heart pounding a forgotten rhythm against his ribs. He knelt down, his large, calloused hand reaching out to pick up the bird from her trembling fingers. He traced the familiar notch on the wing, the tiny, almost invisible inscription. "This belonged to my daughter," he said, his voice raw, hoarse with emotion. "Lily." He watched Mary's face closely, searching for any flicker of recognition, any spark that might confirm the impossible thought blooming in his mind. The air in the cabin crackled with a tension that threatened to overwhelm them both. He began to speak, his words hesitant at first, then flowing with a torrent of suppressed grief and memory. He told her about Lily, about her bright spirit, her love for the forest, her mischievous smile. He described the day she vanished, a spring morning 15 years ago, when she had gone to pick wildflowers and never returned. He spoke of the desperate searches, the fading hope, the agonizing realization that she was gone. He spoke of the guilt that had gnawed at him for years, the questions that haunted his waking hours and filled his nightmares. As he spoke, Mary listened, her eyes fixed on him, a strange mixture of awe and dawning comprehension clouding their green depths. Her own forgotten memories, once fragmented and elusive, began to coalesce, like pieces of a long-lost puzzle falling into place. Mary, tears now streaming down her face, started to recount her own earliest memories, faint and fragmented at first, then growing clearer with each word. She spoke of a warm, comforting presence, a man who sang her lullabies, a small cabin nestled amongst tall trees. She described the day she got lost, venturing too far from the cabin, chasing a butterfly. She remembered being found by strangers, a harsh woman and a rough man who seemed to appear out of nowhere, their faces shadowed and their words sharp. She remembered being taken far away, from one place to another, always feeling an inexplicable longing for a place she couldn't quite recall. The pieces of her fragmented past, previously nonsensical, now began to align with Elias's heartbreaking narrative, forming a tapestry of shared tragedy and unbelievable coincidence. As the storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within the cabin, Elias and Mary sat together, two souls connected by an unimaginable thread of fate. He pulled out the faded photographs from the box, pointing to a small, smiling girl with bright, green eyes. "This is Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mary looked at the picture, then at Elias, then back at the picture, a profound recognition settling over her face. The resemblance was undeniable. The same strong jawline, the same set of the mouth, but most strikingly, the identical shade of vibrant green in her eyes. It was a truth too monumental to grasp all at once, a miracle born from the deepest despair. The silence that followed was not one of awkwardness, but of profound understanding, of a broken past slowly, painstakingly beginning to mend. The revelation hung heavy in the air, a truth both miraculous and overwhelming. Elias, his mind reeling, knew there was more to uncover. The man who had sold Mary in Willow Creek, the one she called kin, was not merely a stranger. He was a link to the 15 years of unanswered questions. Elias's initial relief at finding his daughter quickly morphed into a simmering anger, a fierce protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He realized that Mary, or rather Lily, had not just been lost, she had been taken and likely exploited. The innocent child he had known had endured a life of hardship and uncertainty, and the thought fueled a cold resolve in his heart. He looked at Lily, truly seeing her for the first time in years, not as a lost memory, but as the strong, resilient young woman she had become. Lily, still reeling from the shock, felt a surge of emotions, disbelief, a fragile hope, and a deep, gnawing sense of injustice. The fragmented memories that had haunted her for years now coalesced into a terrifying reality. She remembered the faces of the strangers who had taken her, the man and woman who had presented themselves as distant relatives after her disappearance. They had been cruel, demanding, constantly moving, keeping her isolated from anyone who might question their story. She recalled being forced to work from a young age, begging in towns, helping with petty thefts, always under threat and always told that she had no one else, that they were her only family. The realization that these people had stolen her entire childhood, her family, and her very identity burned within her, a quiet but potent fury. Elias knew he couldn't let this injustice stand. He had to find the man who had sold Lily, and through him uncover the full truth of what had happened all those years ago. He spoke to Lily about his plans, his voice firm with a renewed purpose. "We need to find out who did this, Lily," he said, "and why." Lily, though still shaken, met his gaze with a newfound determination. She was no longer just a lost child. She was a survivor, and she wanted answers. She remembered the man's face vividly, the pockmarks on his skin, the twitch in his left eye. She could even recall the general direction from which they had arrived at Willow Creek, a detail that provided Elias with a crucial starting point. Armed with Lily's fragmented memories and his own rekindled resolve, Elias prepared to leave the timberland. He carefully packed his rifle, his few supplies, and some extra food. Lily, despite her youth, insisted on accompanying him, her eyes reflecting a steely resolve that mirrored his own. She was no longer content to simply exist. She wanted to reclaim her past, to understand the forces that had shaped her life. As they left the familiar comfort of the cabin, leaving the towering trees behind, a new kind of bond solidified between them. It was a bond forged, not just in rediscovered kinship, but in a shared purpose, a quest for justice that would lead them back into the unforgiving landscape of the American West, towards a truth that promised to be both painful and liberating. The journey back through the frontier towns was arduous, filled with dusty roads, suspicious stares, and the ever-present threat of danger. Elias, with Lily by his side, followed the faint trail of rumors and whispers, piecing together the movements of the shifty-eyed man. They encountered reluctant informants, saloon owners with too much to hide, and lonely prospectors who had seen. A lot of desperate souls passed through. Each lead, no matter how small, fueled their resolve. Lily, with her sharp memory and quiet observations, proved invaluable, often noticing details Elias overlooked. She pointed out a peculiar brand on a horse, a familiar buckle on a passing wagon, details that slowly but surely narrowed their search. The shared pursuit of justice began to heal the wounds of their long separation, their conversations growing richer, their understanding of each other deepening with every mile. Finally, after weeks of relentless searching, they tracked the man to a remote, dilapidated shack nestled deep in a forgotten valley, far from any established town. The air hung heavy with a sense of unease, the silence broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Elias approached cautiously, his rifle at the ready, his heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and grim satisfaction. Lily stayed close behind. Him, her small hand clutching a smooth river stone she had found, her face a mask of determined resolve. As they neared the shack, the sound of voices, harsh and argumentative, drifted from within. It was the shifty-eyed man arguing with a woman, the same woman Lily vaguely remembered from her childhood, the one who had also played a part in her abduction. The confrontation was swift and tense. Elias burst into the shack, surprising. The two, the man, his eyes widening in recognition and fear, tried to flee, but Elias was quicker, his years of hunting making him swift and decisive. The woman shrieked, her face contorting in rage and fear. Under Elias's unrelenting questioning, and with Lily's quiet but unwavering presence, the full, ugly truth slowly unraveled. They confessed to finding Lily wandering lost in the woods, realizing she was an easy target, and deciding to take her and exploit her. They had been moving from town to town, always just ahead of suspicion, using her to beg, to pickpocket, to provide a constant source of income, all while weaving a tangled web of lies about her origins. The revelation, though painful, brought a strange sense of clarity and closure to Lily. The weight of the unknown, of a life lived in shadows, finally began to lift. With the truth laid bare, Elias ensured that justice, in the rough and ready manner of the frontier, was served. He didn't resort to violence, but he left them with a clear and undeniable message that their deceit and cruelty would no longer be tolerated. He made sure they would never again profit from the exploitation of innocent children. The journey back to the timberland was different this time. The silence was not of sorrow or apprehension, but of peace and burgeoning hope. Lily, now truly Lily, walked beside her father, her steps lighter, her eyes brighter. The burden of a stolen past had been lifted. replaced by the profound joy of rediscovery. As they finally reached their cabin, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, it no longer felt like a lonely outpost. It felt like a home, filled with the promise of a future forged from hard-won truth and rediscovered love. Elias, the solitary lumberjack, had found not just a daughter, but a renewed purpose, a reason to mend the broken pieces of his life. Lily, the lost girl, had found her father, her identity, and a place where she truly belonged. The echoes in the timberland were no longer of loss, but of a quiet, profound happiness, a testament to the enduring power of family and the resilience of the human spirit in the rugged heart of the American West.